Hello, everyone. We're back again with our live Meet the Filmmakers sessions. And today we are very happy to have two filmmakers with us. The filmmaker of Inside Outside, which is a documentary about female mass incarceration, and they're going to talk about that in further detail. It's a film made by Nandini Sikand, who we have had the pleasure of hosting with a short film in our festival in a previous edition. We also have, and hope eventually to be able to have her, Dr. Teresa Mular, who is the director of Can't Stop the Sun from Shining, which is a documentary film about four centenary women, 100 years old, I should say, or near, because they are not all 100 years old. And we are going to talk to her about her film. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our guests. And we have Zahra Rasul, who is our moderator, and she is from Al Jazeera Contrast, which is a beautiful program. And let me tell you who she is. And there you go. Zahra Rasul is an Emmy-nominated producer and media entrepreneur who leads the storytelling and innovative studio Al Jazeera Contrast, AJ Contrast, part of Al Jazeera Network. Working at the forefront of new technologies and recognized as a force in the art of immersive journalism, Rasool is pioneering collaborative ways of telling urgent stories about underrepresented communities and related conflict in a way that empowers diverse voices. Thank you very much, Zahra, for being with us and moderating this show for us today. And I'm going to come out of the studio and let the two of you discuss the films.
Thank you so much, Nora.
Thank you. This is the film we are discussing, and we have Nandini Sikand, our director, with us.
Firstly, Nandini, I want to congratulate you on this film. It's so urgent, it's compelling, and I'm honored to be moderating this and having a discussion with you. I spent the past 2 years working on a project about mass incarceration myself, female mass incarceration, and so I understand how important this topic is. I spent 2 years reading about understanding how huge and massive this problem is and how many different aspects of life it touches in America. And we premiered. We were lucky to premiere our project at Sundance at the beginning of this year before the pandemic happened. So it's a topic that I'm really familiar with, and I just wanted to start off by letting you introduce yourself a little bit, to talk about your background and how you came about doing this movie Inside Outside, which I understand you've spent 7 years working on.
Yeah. Thank you, Zara, and it's an honor to be having this conversation with you, especially as somebody who knows the work, understands the work, and is doing the work. What I would say is that, the film did start, the project did start about 7, now probably 8 years ago. And it's when I moved to Eastern Pennsylvania, and I got involved with learning about a woman there called Dr. Bonnie Winfield, who's actually featured in the film, and the work that she was doing with the women at Northampton County Jail, which is a jail in Eastern Pennsylvania. And I knew I was interested, but wasn't obviously ready to start thinking about filming. So I really sort of immersed myself in just learning about the issues, which, as you have already outlined, are really enormous, right? There's so many, and it's sort of like when you unravel one thread in a sweater, everything sort of comes apart. So it's the more you learn, the more there is. And so for many years, that's what I was doing, really taking a class, being in the jail. I still volunteer at the jail. Well, now with COVID, not so much, but I volunteer as a yoga teacher there. So we're really immersed in the community. So that's what happened. And I think, the film, and I will say this as filmmakers, very often we start with a film and we think, okay, what's the next project? For me, this is my project, not just the film, but all the work that surrounds it. And so being in conversation with people and makers like yourself, but also people who are writing, organizing, doing work around, the prison industrial complex as a whole, which, as we know, is really a problem.
Yeah. For people who don't know much about the industrial complex, could you just really briefly discuss or describe what that actually means?
Yeah, so I'll try. So it is, I think one of the reasons is to sort of think about why we call it the prison industrial complex, right? It's not just about putting people in cages, right? It's not just about that kind of deep injustice. But what we are doing is, I think something that is really grounded in and built on forms of racial capitalism. And it's so, when I first started this project, I used to think, wow, this system is really messed up. It's really broken. And in fact, the more work I do, I'm coming to realize that the system isn't messed up. It is working exactly as the way it's supposed to work. And in fact, that it requires, capitalism requires inequality, and one of my sort of prison abolitionists whose work I really admire and look to, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, she talks about this, and she says capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it. So that's sort of the enormity of it. And as a country, we incarcerate the most people in the world. I mean, that's sort of is a shocking statistic, but yet it's happening every single day. So I think the idea of really, and it is sort of, it is sort of happening in spaces where we're not privy to really what is happening. And I think so many organizers and that are really trying to draw attention, and theorists and writers and scholars and artists and activists are trying to draw attention to exactly what a huge problem it is. And it isn't new, right? This is something that we have to realize, that it is increasing, and it is also endemic to our entire society and touches every aspect of it. So the minute you start to think that you have a handle on it, there's another layers of which, there's a relationship. And I just want to say quickly, what we're seeing right now, with sort of the Black Lives Matter uprisings in the midst of a global pandemic, those issues are not unrelated to the carceral system, right? I mean, the way that, police works, right? That you have to arrest people in order to put them in, to incarcerate them. And there's a very close relationship there. So I don't think you can sort of really look at the prison industrial complex without sort of unraveling what it's surrounded by and all the systems in place that really keep it in place in addition to prisons.
There's so much to unpack in what you've said right now. And so I'm going to attempt to sort of, pick a little bit in all of that and delve a little deeper. For our audience that's out there, if you watched Nandini's documentary, you've seen the statistics. And, a few of the statistics that I want to draw attention to is over 2.4 million people are incarcerated in the US. Over 200,000 women are in jails or prisons. And this actually, I know from my own research, this has been a 750% increase in the number of women being incarcerated in the US since the 1980s. And actually, women are the fastest growing incarcerated population, which to me is, it's troubling when you have women, when you have mothers behind bars. And so could you talk a little bit about the difference between, or the impact on your community, on families, on the society in general, when you have more women behind bars?
Yeah. So one of the reasons I wanted to make the film is because a lot of the work that's been done, and you probably found this as well, is that most of the work that's been done in documentaries around mass incarceration, especially, has been focused on men, right? And while that is really urgent as well, people are not as focused on women. And I think they're unique in terms of what is happening right in these spaces. So, yes, as many of them are mothers. So now and very often, a lot of the women, they come from single person households. So when you put a mother behind bars, what you're doing is it's not just the woman, but you're affecting the whole family. If eventually many of the kids, and even the kids in the film, end up in foster care, end up going to live with other parts of, other people in their family. So it's a real sort of, trauma and disruption for them. And then what happens is, and what I would also say, I think, I've found that a lot of the women, for them, I would say every single woman that I interviewed in the film, and all the women I interviewed are actually in the documentary, every single one of them had suffered some form of trauma that started either in terms of witnessing a homicide or sexual abuse or harm, or domestic violence, and ended up most of them using substances in order to cover up that trauma. So there's an effect that happens, and this would mostly happen when they were very young. So now what happens is that instead of dealing with mental health issues, we are in fact punishing and criminalizing the traumas that are associated with those with those issues, right? So as a society, we really need to take a look and say, what are we doing, right? What are we doing? Why are we, re-traumatizing and recriminalizing these women who already suffered so much? So I think that is what's unique for the women. The other thing I would say is these spaces are not built for women, right? They're not built for anybody. Let me be really clear about that. They're not built for human habitation, right? But I think for women, there's a unique issue. There are other films that have, dealt with women being shackled during childbirth, for example. What does that look like, where you give birth to your child and then within 24 hours you have to give them up? What kind of country does that? So I think there are so many ways that, we really, really are sort of, it's absolutely, inhumane. And things like menstrual products, for example, women are allocated a certain supply based on what, I'm not sure. But again, little things like that, you have to, the challenges of having to do that, right? Sort of having to, rely on a correctional officer to provide you with sort of things that, which are a need for women. These are things that, just don't make any sense, right? And so, and they're very much, because they're very much invisible to when we think about what it means to have women behind bars. And the last thing I'll say is just not to also, value women only because they're mothers, right? We should value women just because they're people as well, and women, and they don't need to be mothers for that. So I think, yes, but I do think that there's a cyclical effect that happens. And then, what are we doing to generation upon generation, right, of people who are now having to deal with the problems of state incarceration.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the cyclical cycle that you mentioned of incarceration, I think, the story of Savannah and Tara in your documentary, I mean, was heartbreaking. Like it touched me in a way that I don't think a lot of stories, so effectively in showing that cyclical violence and generational trauma that we pass on from one generation to the next. The other statistic that's in your documentary, which is over 80% of women that are in jails and prisons are mothers. And that's what's happening, right? Like, you're incarcerating these women. When they have children, they're passing on that trauma to those children. And I want to talk a little bit about, I don't think we can talk about incarceration without actually talking about the systems or lack of systems of rehabilitation in place, correct? Because what we're doing essentially is the US has a punitive system, not a rehabilitative one. And these women who have committed crimes because of some trauma, but instead of addressing that, we're punishing them. And that leads to punishing their children as well. And can you talk a little bit about that in the context of Tara and Savannah's story?
Yeah, absolutely. So, they're complicated stories, and, without getting into too much detail, what I would say is, there is trauma, there is, substance use, there are mental, between the two of them, the mental health issues. Tara herself went through, and she talks about this in the film, she talks about, discovering her mother's after she, committed suicide. And, and so never really being able to fully, I don't know, that's just for, somebody who's not incarcerated, right? That's a trauma, that's a lifelong trauma that one, has to deal with. But instead, right, when you associated behaviors, right, we are now sort of incarcerating them. And the trauma, you can never deal with the substance use issues if you don't deal with the underlying trauma, right? But as a nation, that's what we've chosen to do. We've chosen to outsource, right, as you pointed out, all our basic sort of basic social services. And not only outsource, but also criminalize. So we're never really dealing with that. And Savannah, who has been, in and out of rehabilitation, right? It's been an ongoing challenge with her own sort of personal history. So, there are sort of quote unquote success stories in the film, but that's really not the point of it, because by and large, what I'm seeing, and even with the women in the film, is what I'm seeing is that they are. They're not, right? Many of them are ending back up in jail. And so the film ends, with sort of an update of where each of them are at, but it's already out of date because Many of them are back and back inside or back outside. Many of them I've lost contact with because there is no way to be in contact. And so it is really, it is dire. It is dire. That's what I would say.
I'm just going to jump in at this point because we have Dr. Teresa Mular, who's already in the studio, and she is the other guests of this conversation. You can carry on either one with one film and then come to the next, or you can involve everybody. It's your show. But
okay, sounds good. I'll probably pull in Dr. Mular into the conversation as well. But before I jump to Dr. Mular, and thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. I do want to ask Nandini. There was your film is so comprehensive in the fact that it doesn't just touch upon incarceration, and I think this speaks to the testament of the amount of time and the relationships you've built with the women. But you've also followed them through them being released and then going back into prisons or jails, or into jails in your case, which is the problem of recidivism. And can you talk a little bit about how that is such a big issue in this country? It's not just about incarceration, but it is about not being able to keep these people out of these criminal systems once they've been released.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's been the challenge, right? Because we're not fixing the problem, right? We're not fixing the issue of substance use disorder. We're not fixing the underlying trauma. We're not fixing the poverty, right? The criminalization. So if we're not doing that, of course, when you come out of jail, you've already served your time, right? But you can't get a job. You can't live in public housing. You don't have access to healthcare. You don't have access to childcare. If you're lucky, you get your kids back. So there's just stacked upon issue, we are setting up people to fail. And so recidivism shouldn't be a surprise to us, because the support is just not there. And if the people, there's a person in the film who, knock on wood, is, a success story, it's there because of family support. It's not there because she has, and because of who she is, but that's not, it's not because we have put anything in place really that helps.
And just for our audience out there, and I really love being able to bring in facts and data into the conversation so that I think people can understand the scale. I think that was what struck me the most about this issue, is how many people were affected by it. And even with the statistics about recidivism, I read that over 2/3 of people, or 2/3 of women, go back to prison within a duration of 3 years of their release, which is just crazy. It means more than half of people end up back where they started from because they didn't have enough support in place for them to keep them out of trouble.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I think what we have to think about is removing the conditions that they end up in jail in the first place. That's the only way it's going to change.
Exactly. I'm gonna bring Dr. Mular into the conversation here. Your film, which is in contrast to Inside Outside, but is equally beautiful, and also just a story that I don't hear very much about, because it is about much older women celebrating their accomplishments and their life. And I'd just like you to talk a little bit, just give us a brief synopsis about the film for our audience out there.
Yeah, the film is about 4 women in the autumn, winter of their lives, and it explores the challenges that they've had in their lives, the success, the adaptation throughout the decades, since the oldest woman was 105, almost 106, and the youngest one 95. So throughout the decades, they had to endure wars, 2 world wars, and a pandemic, the Spanish flu, and of course this one. And the stamina they have had, in spite of difficult relationships with the father or the mother or the environment, they were able to succeed. And I think in that way, we have a connection with the women whose environment was perhaps not so good and ended up incarcerated. But they're still, women tend to be very strong. And I admire those ones who are the depiction of the women in prison, because I don't think they were weak. They just had the wrong environment, the wrong society around, perhaps. So anyway, these four women are very inspiring. They were inspiring to me, and I wanted to share with the audience at large that aging is not so much of a problem. Ageism is a prejudice, and we should fight for against that, because just because we get older doesn't mean that we cannot be productive. And I think that's the point of it, that age is just a number, but people tend to see older ones with a negative light. And
Absolutely.
that's not
Yeah. And I think what really struck me about your film, because I also watched it after I watched Inside Outside, you're seeing this film of women being incarcerated, and you understand as their stories unfold, everything's stacked against them. They're set up for failure, and they're constantly failing. With your film, you're seeing Ruth, who's 94, Adele, who's 100, Dodo, who's 105, and Edith, who's 96, and their stories unfold. And it's so positive. And I found myself thinking when I was watching your film, I want to be like them. That's how I felt. It's like, they had their own challenges, but you didn't find, it was the system wasn't against them. They were set up in a very different way than the movies and Inside Outside. And I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of, you can pick any of these women who are in your. Firstly, I want to start by saying, what inspired you? How did you meet the four of them? Are they your friends?
The only Dodo was a friend of mine since 1980s. The other ladies I found through one through sound engineer who deals mostly with classical music, and he referred me to Ruth Lenshinska, the pianist. And the other two I found through another friend of mine who is a doctor in piano. He is a professor at Stony Brook University in New York, and he connected me with Adele and with Edith. So why did I or how did I come up with this? I think that earlier on in my career as a physician, gynecologist, and obstetrician, I had a special liking and interest for older women, my patients, and I cared for them intimately. It was not just a person, but a person with a personality. I cared for them, and they had a magnetic pull that drove me and compelled me to connect with them in a special way. And I think that, of course, Dodo, the 105.6, as she called it, or 105.8, as she would call herself, inspired me as well. And originally I wanted to do this film and call it 100+ because I wanted to find other individuals that were 100+, but I had to lower my bar, and I did it to 94, 95. I didn't want to drop it further. And I was lucky because women tend to live more also than men, and so so that was my motivation I was inspired by Dodo, and I searched for others, and they inspired me as well. And I wanted to share that with other people.
And I think you've done it beautifully. And it's just a gorgeous film. Also, to be able to see how you've pulled in archival footage into it, with these women talking, and they are so spirited and just so interesting to listen to. So it was just really well done and really well edited as well, I must say.
Yes, my editor did a great
Yeah.
job. Leah Goodsmith, she's amazing. She
Yeah.
really made the film flourish.
Yeah.
Because it's not just the material that we have and the questions that we ask,
Mm-hmm.
but it's how to display it and how to put it together with the connective tissue, just so wonderfully done. I was very lucky, and she did win an award for best editing in February in London. She's a remarkable individual. I owe most of this film to, in terms of putting it together, to her. Yes.
That's lovely. Also, to our audience that's out there, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave your questions in the live comment section, and I'll be sure to ask Dr. Mular and Nandini your questions. Nandini, I'm going to bring you in back here. Again, like I said, watching these two films, what really struck me is, how certain people are set up for success and others are not. And that's the kind of systemic racism or discrimination that is inherent in our societies. And I want you to talk a little bit more about that, because there is the racism part of it. The American system is inherently racist towards certain folks, especially Black people. But also there is a poverty and an economic angle to that. Most of the people we see in your film are not women that are coming from well-off backgrounds or people that have easy access to education or healthcare. So I want you to talk a little bit about how poverty becomes an underlying factor for incarceration.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Thank you. So, one of the ways I've been trying to understand this as well, and I mentioned this at the top of the hour, is to talk about in the context of racial capitalism, as I said. And I think, because disproportionately, yes, Black and brown bodies are incarcerated, absolutely. But I also would say that it's, in addition to that, it also thrives on inequality. And so there's at that intersection of both sort of racism and capitalism, which thrives on inequality, right, in itself, is sort of the prison industrial complex. It's almost like a perfect storm. And so what happens as a result is it is very much about access. So I'll give you an example. If somebody gets a DUI, right, driving under the influence, if you come from a wealthy family, you can get off with community service and not have to go to jail. However, if you don't have that option, you have to go to jail. So now let's think about this. We have the same exact crime, so to speak, and crime, I put in quotes here. And what people are doing is that if you can afford to not have to go to jail, you don't have to. So in part of it's already embedded in the law, embedded in the system is that it is set up it is designed exactly to further create inequality for people who are already in jail. And so, again, sort of coming back to Ruth Wilson Gilmore, she talks about the phrase lawfare, right? We talk about warfare against our citizens. She talks about lawfare, how the law itself is set up in a way for inequality. And that's just one example, right? But if you think about, and on the back end of sort of, people trying to find their way in terms of coming back. So you have to now, if you're on parole or probation, you have to meet your officer. What do you do with your children? How do you get them? Your license has been taken away, but you have to go meet and check in with your parole officer, but you'd have no way to get that because there's no public transport. So, these are all these things that the system continuously dehumanizes, but also sets you up to fail, as we've talked about. So you're constantly criminalizing people's poverty, and there is absolutely, little way for people to escape that. And so we have to see, that's why it is systemic. And I think the challenges for me was how do you take these personal stories, but really sort of also keep our focus on the systemic part of it, because sure. I don't think we want to be side of that.
Absolutely. And how did you actually do that? Because I think you struck a really great balance. Like, explaining the situation, but also giving us enough of these women's stories that we felt connected to it.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency when we watch a film, we personalize it, right? And I think that's the beauty of cinema. We get to sort of get focused on, oh, this person has this horrible life and this horrible story. But in fact, what I tried to do was, as I mentioned earlier, all the women that I interviewed, I ended up using in the film because I don't want, it's not a personal story. For every woman that is in that film, in that frame, there are thousands outside of it that whose stories we will never know and we will never get to know. So to me, they're like a chorus of women, but they're still really trying to, they're not the only story. And creating the systemic part of it is really keeping an eye on that. And that's what I tried to do with the statistics in the film, sort of reminding us that, this is what's happening, this is the context. So yes, we may see a really heartrending moment between a mother and a child, but let's keep in mind that 80% of people who are behind bars are mothers. So multiplying that. So I think that for me was really important, trying to create that context.
That's lovely. I'm going to go to Dr. Mular. You actually have two questions from the audience. So I'm going to read out the first one. It's from Natalie. Thank you for your question. Natalie says her grandmother passed away 1 year ago at the age of 96, and she was totally lucid until the very end. She remembers a lot of strangers who would act like she was senile. And what would you say to this perception?
To the perception of someone assessing the person as senile?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I would say that person has a myopic mind and unable to see beyond the age of an individual and to see into the eyes and into the soul of that person, because it is not just the age. I think that whoever has a comment of that style is really in need to get psychological glasses and see that 90 or 95 or 100 is just a number. There are people who are 30, 20, 50 or 40 are unable to think or to act or to propel themselves and to inspire others for whatever reason, and yet they are, quote, young and seen in a different way. Age is just a number. It is how we feel inside. Yes, it is true. It is true. I'm not a spring chick. This is my second career. I could have just stopped working and sit down in a cafe somewhere and do nothing. I chose to do something more. It is within our own selves whether we want to make something out of our lives. And I think in that other film that we are discussing, these are some of those women came out and wanted to be useful to society and to themselves as well, and to their families. So it takes two to tango, if you will, but it is the spirit of being propelled forwards and doing something for others, to give of ourselves and to receive. We give to get. So it works both ways, and it behooves us to be able to give and to feel productive at whatever age. So that's
and I mean, reading your bio, I think it was probably one of the most impressive and illustrious bios I've read of you, Dr. Mular. Very few people have accomplished the breadth of the work that you've done, being a medical doctor yourself to then working in the arts and producing some award-winning films that were featured all around the world. I mean, you're an inspiration yourself. And on that note, I do have another question for you. In our email communication, you mentioned that, Edith just published her book, and you were telling me a little bit more about her backstory, which I found incredibly inspiring, because you said she didn't start her academic career until she was over 30. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, she had a tough life. As you know, she came from Cologne, from Germany, and was sort of married by the mother's choice, by her mother's choice, and had children. But after that, she felt compelled to go and study. So she went and got a master's and a PhD in biology. And she taught at the NYU until the age of 94. And she also took piano lessons at the age of 80. And since her son worked for Steinway Sons, he told me that he was able to sell more pianos to his customers when they were coming into the store, because he was saying, oh, my mother started learning a piano at the age of 80. So people were saying, oh, okay, so I guess I can start also at a later age. But she did write a wonderful book called My Exciting Journey to 95. And in it, she relates the story from the moment she was a baby and until that age. So I think that all these women, 3 out of 4, wrote books. Of course, Ruth Lenchinska has written a book in 1957. She was born in 1925, and her book is striking. I read it several times, and that's a book called The Forbidden Childhood. And then Adele also wrote a book of poems in 2013 when she was 94. And Dodo, she didn't have to write a book. She just sang with all her life, where we kept singing each week on the phone up until now. Yeah, she was a force of nature and inspired everybody around. Even last year, she asked me to bring her to a restaurant for pizza. And she walked into the restaurant, and I was, I had another dinner. So she said, I'm going to go alone. And I was looking to make sure she wouldn't fall. And she says, stop looking at me. I am going to have my dinner. And then when I'm finished, I'm going to call a taxi and go home. And so that was when she was almost 105. Amazing. She didn't have to write a book. She wrote the book by inspiring all of us. It's striking.
That's amazing. That's absolutely incredible. And Nandini, I'm going to go to you, because I can't stop thinking about the differences in opportunities, or the challenges inherent for some people versus others. And I have 2 questions for you. One's about the film, and I'm going to ask you something slightly personal after that. But talking about the film, tell me about the re-entry process. These women, once they're out of prison, if they decide, I want to get a job, or I want to go to university, or I want to do X, Y, and Z, whatever it is that I want to follow, my passions or my dreams, how easy or how difficult it is for them to do something like that.
Yeah. So let's talk about getting a job, right? Right now there's a campaign underfoot. It's called Ban the Box. And I think, it's getting wider. But you know how those job forms where you have to fill out, have you ever been convicted, So that's what happens. Most people, when HR will get those, they will throw out those forms, because people will not typically hire someone been previously incarcerated. So it makes it already very hard. I think one of the things that a lot of organizers are trying to do is to call the Ban the Box campaign, right? So to get rid of that, so that if people do have to declare it, then they declare it at a point when they're going, further down the interview process. So it's not the first thing that people see when they, but it's imperfect, and that's sort of, just to be able to survive is a challenge, and sort of getting those jobs. And even if they do get those sorts of jobs, right, they tend typically to be, sort of low paying, and barely, barely able to survive on those kinds of things. Now, add to that, right, you need to pay rent. You need to, if you want trying to get your kids back, as we found out, in the and the two twins, Christy and Carrie, who ended up, whose children were in foster care, and then having to get them back, and all the hoops that they had to jump through sheer just, determination. And they did. And they are now, doing well and successful, and, managing to sort of got their kids back. But, it was not without just sheer grit and determination. And yes, as they talk about in the film, the sort of child services, right? We're also a problem, constantly sort of creating sort of hurdles for them to do that. So reentry, and that word, assumes even that word is a challenge, and I've used it, but I'm sort of moving away from using it as well, because reentry, nobody's entering, right? There is no reentry. It isn't smooth. It isn't. We make it sound like, we're sort of landing back at an airport and now there's reentry back, right? And there isn't any of that. And I think if it does exist, it's really to do with family support. It's really to do with, it's not to say services don't exist, but they are so thin and we are constantly cutting their budgets, because the truth is, we don't value these citizens, right? And to think about what these citizens can contribute to our community, and if we're thinking about them as part of our community, just imagining how rich it would be because of that. So education exists. There are college programs. I mean, a lot of them have been cut, but there's sort of small bits and pieces where it depends on the correctional facility. So, for example, I was teaching a class at the jail, and because of COVID, the class got cut short. And so what that means is, I don't know if the men who are in my class are ever going to be able to do a college class again, right, or college level class again. So it is very. It is really makes it very hard. The one thing I would say is that, for those of us who are able to, is really starting to think about how can we turn those single college classes into a degree, right? How can we sort of get people to be able to sort of get a proper education, right? And I think that could be something that, we can all, and people are already, a lot of people are already working towards that, but those are sort of small things that we can do. So rather than just feel hopeless, which I think there are times when there is a lot happening, right? There's a lot happening in organizers around, whether it's education or social services. There's a lot already at work in terms of getting folks to be able to access those services.
Sure. Am I right to assume that you don't have anybody in your immediate family who's been impacted by incarceration, Nandini?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there is some personal stuff I don't want to really get into, but I think
I'm just asking that because I want to know, how did working on this film, working on this issue for the past 7 years, has impacted your worldview, or just how you view the state of the country and politics in general?
Yeah, well, you're asking me this in the midst of a global pandemic, as I said, an uprising around, what has sort of been a long 400-year battle around, racial violence. What I would say is that it is really, I think the work needs to be done. I think the work is already happening. I will say this. I think starting this work, I knew it was what I said, a broken system. I think working on this film has firmly moved me into becoming an abolitionist, a prison abolitionist, an abolitionist for police. I think that we have done so much damage. We basically, declared domestic war on these citizens. And I don't think I'm overstating it when I say that. So I think there is a lot happening. And I think people sort of think about abolition as this pipe dream, but it's already happening, right? Atlanta recently shut down a jail. San Francisco has done the same. And there are abolitionists who have been working at this for decades now, largely the movement led largely by Black feminists, and who have been doing the work. And I think we're at this moment, right, where people are really starting to think about abolition and really engaging more fully with that conversation, both along the lines of defunding the police and the carceral state, and also prisons. So that gives me a lot of hope. And I really think that that's something that we can all, as individuals, as citizens, really engage with that conversation locally and in other ways.
It's really interesting you say that, because I think that's where I landed too after spending just 2 years researching this topic, is, understanding the importance of abolishing these systems. But for our viewers out there who might not necessarily be as acquainted with what prison abolition means or stands for, can you very briefly describe that, please?
So I'll say it's not one thing, right, in terms of addressing it. I mean, again, coming back to Gilmore, she talks about abolition is really about abolishing the conditions that caused us to create prisons in the first place. So what does that mean, right? It means that addressing what we talked about earlier, the social issues, that we sort of not criminalizing poverty, not criminalizing violence, right? I think we have to deal with the issue of violence. I think very often in the context of the carceral conversations we have that, these are not violent offenders. But when we think about people who commit violent crimes, we also have to think about the violence that they were exposed to before they committed the crime. How do we address that? I think we have to ask that question. And, she talks about abolition as being organized abandonment. That's what we have done to our citizens. So how do we sort of undo that work? And the thing to think about with abolition is that it's not a pipe dream. It's already happening. So that's, I think, is the sort of note of hope that I want us to hold on.
Yeah, that's very powerful. I really love when you say you've got to abolish the conditions that led us to create prisons in the first place. And I think that's just the most powerful way to describe it. And I think kind of applies to all of the other systems that we're talking about abolishing as well, police, and other intelligence, immigration services. Dr. Mular, I'm going to pull you into the conversation here. You have two comments. One's by Susan, who says that every time we watch, we see more beauty in the film. Adele and Dodo are watching. And then we have a question from Jonathan, who is Dodo's grandson. And he says that he found the film quite moving. He congratulates you, and he's asking, if there were a sequel to your film, what direction would you take it?
Yes, I thank you first of all to grandson, Dodo's grandson, to the entire family who I know for a long time. It was my honor and privilege to be able to be her friend and meet her family and be part of them. She passed away. Dodo passed away, unfortunately, May 14, 15, and Adele passed exactly 24 hours later after that. And my heart goes out to the families because they are still so vividly present in my heart and mind. I want to say, yes, I have a plan for a sequel, but this time with men. And I have lined up already two, an 100-year-old cellist who's a professor emeritus here in Queens, and a 95-year-old gynecologist who's still working. And so I'm looking for maybe another two. I might have to lower the bar again because men don't live that long, but I'm trying hard to find them, and I hope that this will be the sequel. So to show not just women, but that men can feel young at heart. And so that's the project that I have. And hopefully, once the pandemic situation is cleared, then I can proceed, because these are obviously high-risk individuals. I can proceed with, interviewing and doing more, close work with camera and so forth. So,
that's lovely. That's one more reason for us to really wish the pandemic to be over. And to all our live audience out there, we're about to wrap up our conversation. So if you have any final thoughts, any questions, feel free to leave them in the live comments. Dr. Mular, I wanted, this is a question that I'm personally dying to ask you, is, if these women were to give advice to younger women, what do you think is they would tell us?
Yes. Well, actually, I did ask that question to each one of them. And Ruth, the pianist, who's an amazing pianist, still performing all over the world, her message was, you have to give, because you make people happy. And when they are happy, they give back. And Ruth keeps saying that, it's music that lights up our soul. And therefore, I think that being able to receive or express through the world, the universe of music, is very important to keep moving forwards. And Adele had a sense of faith and belief and acceptance that whatever life brings, you take it even if it is difficult, without without feeling that you are a victim. And so, and Edith is a fighter. She's actually fighting now for her life, and struggling. And she was at the hospital. She wanted to go home. And so the message from her was, and still is, to be strong and to know what you want. And if you know what you want, the odds are you're going to get it. That's the message. I think that would be the summary for the four of them.
What about what would be your advice?
My advice is to keep going, not to let the flame, the spark, as we say in Spanish, I'm from Argentina, la chispa, to have that spark and flame alive, even in the difficult times, because there is always, there is a today, but there is also a tomorrow. And that would be my advice, never to give up, to have hope, and to have believe in yourself that you can do it. That's my message.
And I can tell you there is nobody who embodies that better than you and your film. Thank you so much for those words, Dr. Mular. Nandini, I want to ask you the same question. You know, what is it that you want people to take out of your film? What happens next after we watch this?
I hope that you'll be moved to action, right? To really take this seriously. It is dire, and it's not a feel-good story. It's not intended to be. And I think there are many venues to do that. And I think this moment that we're in right now really challenges us not to do more than just witness, right? To do more than that, to really sort of move it in towards action.
And what are some? Can you just outline a few things that we can do in order to move the conversation forward, to move ourselves forward, or to be able to act?
Yeah. So one of the things I would say, I mean, there's a lot, right? And I think we have to look for those opportunities, right? And I think that opportunities that exist in our community. So, for example, finding out what are the local correctional facilities that exist, right? Find out the organizations that are doing work. There are lots of mutual aid. There's bail reform. Right now, in the midst of a global pandemic, people are not being released, and people are dying in jail, and they have no choice. They have to stay there, and they cannot. They're being quarantined with unsatisfactory conditions. So that's already, you've trapped people in there, and you can't get them out. So I think there's a lot like that we can do. You can write to your local people that are in power. Your city councils. You can talk about getting police out of schools, for example. That's a really simple one, because very often that criminalization starts at such a young age, very often in elementary school. So starting to think about, what is that role? Is that really necessary? Do we need to have cops in classrooms? So I think there is so much that we can do. We just have to be asking the right questions. And people are already doing work. So I think it's about making an effort to connect with local communities and local organizers.
I am so sorry to be the bearer of bad news. This conversation is extremely interesting, and of course there was a particular reason why I put these two films together, because Dr. Mular was asking, well, what does that film have to do with motherhood? And I said, there is a lot that it has to do. And here we are, and I'm very happy that Zahra was pointing out to that as well. What happens when you have a life that gives you certain privileges? We're not saying that these women never suffered. Of course, everyone suffers in their own way. But of course, we're dealing with incarcerated women who had their freedom taken away, all the privileges taken away. This is a conversation that should continue. And I would suggest you do that after we wrap and we take it to the YouTube channel of the festival. It will be posted there tomorrow because YouTube takes time to process. But if you want to look at it immediately, you can do so from our website, from the page where it is for Sunday under the scroll down menu. Mm-hmm. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Zahra again to having done such a wonderful job moderating our session. And also to thank our filmmakers, not only the two filmmakers we have with us today, right here, right now in this chat, but also all the filmmakers who are in this session and all the filmmakers who have been with the Socially Relevant Film Festival in our previous editions, because without these wonderful films of the socially relevant issues that they choose to talk about, there would be no film festival. And of course, I want to thank our sponsors for making it possible for us to continue. This is our 7th edition. This is the last of our Meet the Filmmaker chats. And this is an opportunity for me not only to thank the filmmakers, the jury, all 23 or 4 of them, 24 of them, who spent hours watching the films to designate a winner, to thank our sponsors. All of their names and logos and ads are on our website, and our hospitality and industry sponsors. Please join us at 4 o'clock. See, I have 6 minutes to get there. But if I'm not traveling, I'm going from my computer to another computer. At 4 o'clock, we have a Zoom webinar for the closing awards ceremony.
Thank you so much, Nora. Thank you, Nora, for giving me the honor of talking to such brilliant filmmakers of Nandini and Dr. Mular's stature and talents. And I urge everybody out there, if you've not watched their films, Inside Out and Can't Stop the Sun from Shining, please try and watch them when they're live. Thanks a lot, Bob.
Thank you all. We have to end, unfortunately, so I have time to go and open the Zoom. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.